In a modern courtroom nestled among the towering buildings of New York City, I observed my husband Ryan's face transform in an instant. His look of complete satisfaction disappeared exactly 52 seconds after his attorney wrapped up the reading of the final section in our divorce settlement. No one else in that room understood the weight of what had just occurred. If this story about careful preparation and finding inner strength during difficult times speaks to you, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to the channel for additional accounts of people who turn challenging situations around through patience and planning. Feel free to share in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Hi, I am Daisy, 33 years old, and 1 month ago I signed away every asset I had to my soon-to-be ex-husband. My lawyer had urged me repeatedly not to agree to those terms. My mother-in-law Rose watched from the gallery seats with an unmistakable expression of satisfaction. Ryan's 27-year-old girlfriend even captured a quick selfie during the proceedings. Ryan himself beamed as though he had secured the biggest victory of his career. That smile, however, faded precisely 52 seconds later, once his attorney finished reciting the last clause in the agreement. Before revealing what happened next, let me take you back nearly 3 years to the night when everything began to unravel in ways I could never have imagined. Over 8 years of marriage, I had created what seemed like a complete and enviable life with Ryan in the suburbs just north of New York City. Our home was a large colonial structure with 5 bedrooms that far exceeded our actual needs, set on a quiet street lined with mature trees, where the morning commute into Manhattan took less than an hour by train. Ryan parked his sleek Mercedes SUV in the driveway, while I drove a reliable but aging Toyota sedan that had seen better days, but still got us where we needed to go. We organized dinner parties where Ryan commanded attention with stories from his work in commercial real estate development, and I circulated through the rooms making sure drinks were refreshed and conversations flowed smoothly. The dining room with its long mahogany table often hosted 8 or 10 guests, and the scent of roasted chicken or baked salmon would linger in the air long after everyone had left. On the surface, we embodied the kind of success that many couples strive for in the competitive environment around New York. Ryan had always taken charge of our financial affairs from the very beginning. During our honeymoon, he had used that composed and logical tone he reserved for decisions he had already made. He told me he would manage all the money matters while I took responsibility for the household and daily life. Young in love and eager to steer clear of the destructive arguments over finances that had ended my parents' marriage, I consented without protest. My mother is now 61 years old and my father is 64. Their constant battles had taught me early on that peace sometimes required compromise, even when it meant setting aside my own preferences. I wanted our home to feel stable for the family we planned to build. Before our son Lucas entered the world 6 years ago, I held a demanding position as a senior financial analyst at a respected investment bank located in Manhattan. I excelled at examining complex data sets and identifying inconsistencies that could affect investment decisions. The work suited my natural inclination toward precision and detail, and I often stayed late reviewing market reports, while the city lights twinkled outside the office windows. When I discovered I was pregnant, Ryan arranged a serious conversation one evening in our living room. With the same measured voice he used whenever he wanted to present his conclusion as the only reasonable option, he explained that our child would thrive best with his mother present at home during those early years. He emphasized that his earnings from Empire Development Group were adequate to provide for all of us comfortably. I resigned from my role, exchanging client presentations and financial modeling sessions for playground visits and storytime routines. The transition felt both liberating and confining at the same time. After Lucas began attending kindergarten, I resumed some part-time remote work in financial consulting to maintain my professional edge and stay mentally engaged. I would set up my laptop at the kitchen table after school drop-off and review client portfolios while the house was quiet. Ryan paid little attention to these activities. In his view, I had settled into the role of homemaker dependable, always available, yet somehow unremarkable in the larger scheme of his ambitions. He frequently checked the time on his luxury watch purchased as a reward after closing a significant business transaction and announced that investor discussions would keep him out late into the evening. His home office door stayed locked whenever he was away. Credit card bills arrived exclusively in his email account. I carried only an additional card attached to his account with a restricted spending limit. The office itself smelled of leather and old paper, with framed photos of properties he had developed lining one wall. At the time, I had no idea that the prosperous image Ryan projected rested on increasingly fragile ground. The watch had been bought on credit, and the business he claimed represented our security was facing mounting pressures from unpaid obligations. Lucas changed my entire outlook on what mattered. Our son arrived 6 years ago carrying Ryan's dark hair and my own persistent chin. Holding him for the first time in the hospital, I felt a depth of love that was completely new and all-consuming. It was protective and unconditional in a way that made me constantly evaluate whether I was being the parent he deserved. Those early months were a blur of feedings and lullabies, but they also marked the beginning of my growing awareness that something fundamental was missing in our family dynamic. Ryan regarded Lucas primarily as proof of his own accomplishments, rather than as a little person who needed consistent presence and affection. He would reference our son during business meals, commenting on how the boy already displayed curiosity about property investments, but actual involvement in parenting remained minimal. Ryan missed Lucas's first steps because of an important phone conference. He was out of town when Lucas said his first recognizable word. He skipped nearly every school performance, every conference with teachers, and most nights when a bedtime story might have created a lasting memory. I often found myself making excuses for him too, Lucas saying Daddy was working hard for our future, even as doubt crept in. One evening, roughly a year before the end of our marriage, Lucas waited by the living room window for nearly 90 minutes, with his favorite picture book pressed to his chest. He kept asking when his father would arrive to fulfill the promise of reading together that night. I sent Ryan a message. No response arrived. I left a voicemail that went unreturned. Eventually, Lucas fell asleep on the couch, still clutching the book. When Ryan walked in after 11 o'clock carrying a trace of cologne that did not belong to him, I asked if he had forgotten the commitment he made to our son. He glanced briefly from his phone without much interest. He was building something important for the family's future, he said, and Lucas would understand the sacrifices when he was older. The next morning, I watched Lucas's face fall when he realized his father had come home and left again without saying goodnight. That moment forced me to acknowledge that problems had existed far longer than I had allowed myself to see. Ryan had not hugged our son in over 4 months. He rarely asked about school activities, friends, or anything that mattered in Lucas's small world. Our child had become an obligation rather than a source of joy. The night I learned the full extent of our situation was not planned. Nearly 3 years ago, Lucas needed his passport for an upcoming class field trip to a museum in the city. Ryan kept our important papers in his office, but that evening he left for a late meeting without locking the door behind him. I found the passport easily in the upper drawer where he said it would be. As I pulled it out, however, my fingers touched a folder I had never seen before. The return address on the top envelope made me pause. It came from Empire National Bank. The stamp in red ink read, "Final Notice." My experience working with financial documents made me open it despite the knot forming in my stomach. The loan was 75 days past due with $275,000 still owed on a commercial property. I opened the next envelope from a different lender. It carried warnings about delinquency and required immediate attention. Additional notices from other banks and a collection agency followed. When I finished examining everything in that drawer, my hands shook from the sheer scale of what I had discovered. Ryan's company was losing money at an alarming rate. The commercial properties he had once discussed proudly at gatherings were heavily mortgaged and losing value. The business he said would provide for our retirement carried total debts exceeding $2.8 million, and he had kept all of it hidden from me. I remained seated in his leather chair for quite some time, the documents scattered around me like pieces of a puzzle I had not known existed. The city skyline was visible through the office window, a reminder of the world outside our suburban bubble. Then I did something that surprised me, even as I did it. I took out my phone and photographed every document with clear timestamps and dates visible in each image. I replaced the folder exactly as I had found it, turned off the office light, and walked away. That night, I could not sleep, but the feeling was not panic. I was already thinking through options and next steps with a clarity that surprised me. The following morning, I contacted my older sister Ruby. She is 36 years old and has lived in the New York area her entire adult life. Ruby has always been the person I turn to when I need honest perspective, and she had quietly expressed doubts about Ryan's character on several occasions over the years. I told her everything I had found while sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold. She did not ask unnecessary questions. She simply told me to come to her office the next day with identification. The drive into the city that morning felt longer than usual with traffic on the parkway, giving me time to replay every detail in my mind. Over the following weeks, the information Ruby helped me uncover confirmed my worst fears and showed me details I had not expected. Most of the debt sat in Ryan's name alone, or belonged to his company. But he had taken out 2 loans that included my name as well, using my signature without permission through forgery, or an electronic version I had never approved. Ruby spoke in a low voice when she showed me the paperwork in her small office. This situation involved fraud, she said. I could take legal action if I chose. I folded the copies and put them in my purse. I needed the complete picture before deciding anything. That marked the beginning of nearly 3 years spent learning how to protect myself and my son. I opened a savings account at a completely separate bank that had no ties to Ryan. Every month, I moved small amounts from my part-time consulting income into that account, sometimes $150, sometimes $250. I kept records of every statement and every piece of information that crossed my path. Ruby continued to provide updates whenever she learned something new through her professional connections. The total obligations kept growing rather than shrinking. I was not shocked, but I was becoming prepared for whatever came next. Ryan had no suspicion that his wife was watching his every financial move and building a safety net in silence. About a year before Ryan finally asked for a divorce, subtle changes in his routine began to appear. He started returning home in the early hours of the morning carrying the faint trace of a perfume that did not belong to me. At first, the scent was barely noticeable, mixed with the usual city air and his cologne. I had spent the previous 3 years training myself to notice small details, however, and Ryan had grown increasingly careless around someone he viewed as unimportant. The late nights stretched even later. Investor dinners multiplied without warning. He began purchasing new clothing from high-end designers, including suits that cost over $4,500 each, all charged to cards that were already stretched thin. I continued wearing outfits I had owned for years, focusing instead on keeping Lucas's routine steady. One evening, Ryan left his phone on the kitchen counter while he showered. The screen lit up with an incoming message preview that read, "Cannot wait until tomorrow. Make sure you wear the blue tie tonight. It looks perfect on you." I did not touch the device or open any applications. The preview alone told me everything I needed to know. That same week, I noticed him clearing his browsing history more frequently and changing passwords on his devices. He started taking phone calls in the garage, believing the distance would prevent me from hearing. What Ryan never understood was that I was not driven by jealousy or a desire for revenge. I had already accepted the reality of our marriage long before. My focus remained on gathering information and building a record that would protect Lucas and myself when the time came. During this period, I often turned to my older sister Ruby for perspective. Late one night after seeing that message, I called her. Ruby listened quietly and then reminded me that documenting everything remained the most important step. She encouraged me to stay focused on the long-term plan rather than reacting in the moment. Her support helped me maintain clarity when emotions threatened to surface. The first time I met Lauren Ryan's girlfriend occurred at Rose's birthday celebration. Rose, my mother-in-law, who was then in her early 60s, hosted these monthly gatherings at her elegant home in a prestigious Westchester neighborhood. The property featured manicured lawns, classic architecture, and a grand foyer that always smelled faintly of fresh flowers. I had attended these events for 8 years and always felt like an outsider who had never quite earned full acceptance. That particular evening, Ryan arrived with Lauren on his arm as though she belonged there from the start. He introduced her to the gathered family members as a business associate who had been providing guidance on new investment opportunities for his company. Lauren was 27 years old with carefully styled blonde highlights and a practiced smile. Her dress appeared designer at first glance, but closer inspection revealed uneven stitching and hardware that did not match authentic pieces. She carried a handbag that attempted to imitate a luxury brand, but fell short in the details. No one else seemed to notice these inconsistencies. They were too occupied with welcoming her warmly. Rose took Lauren's hands and announced with genuine enthusiasm that Ryan had finally found someone who understood ambition and drive. Then she glanced in my direction with the thin smile I had grown accustomed to over the years. Daisy, would you be a dear and help bring out the appetizers from the kitchen? I spent most of that dinner moving between the kitchen and the edges of the room, observing my husband present his girlfriend to his family, while they pretended the situation was perfectly normal. Lucas sat beside me, clearly confused by the seating arrangement. "Mommy, who is that lady?" he whispered. "Why is she sitting in your usual chair?" I answered softly that she was someone helping with business matters and not important to our family. Lauren laughed at something Ryan said, her hand resting on his sleeve for longer than necessary. Rose beamed with approval. I thought to myself that the handbag was not the only thing at the table pretending to be something it was not. Lauren was not my enemy. She represented a symptom of deeper problems in my marriage. The real issue remained the man who had hidden his financial troubles and now paraded someone new in front of everyone. 6 months before the final court date, Ryan asked me to sit with him at our dining table one evening after Lucas had gone to bed. He delivered the news in the same detached manner he used for business announcements. "I want a divorce," he said without preamble or apology. I had known this moment was approaching and had prepared for it, yet hearing the words still carried weight. "I see," I replied calmly. "What exactly are you proposing?" Ryan leaned back with the expression he reserved for negotiations with people he considered less experienced. He wanted the house, both vehicles, the company, and every other asset we had accumulated. In return, I could keep Lucas. He had no interest in custody disputes, because raising a child would slow down his plans. He described his offer as generous, noting that many men in his position would fight for custody simply to avoid support payments. I looked at him and realized he saw me as having no real value worth fighting over. "All right." I said quietly. "I will need time to review the details." Ryan appeared surprised by my lack of tears or argument. He agreed to have his lawyer send the paperwork. What he did not know was that I had been waiting for this exact moment for nearly 3 years and was fully ready. Within days, Ryan had begun reshaping the public story of our marriage. He told mutual friends that I was being unreasonable and trying to drag out the process in hopes of claiming half his company, even though I had never worked for it. People we had known for years suddenly stopped returning calls. A parent from Lucas's school offered sympathetic words about how difficult it must be to discover incompatibility. Rose called me shortly after. Her voice carried the cool tone she used when addressing someone who had disappointed her expectations. She reminded me that her son had built the company from the ground up and that I had been fortunate to live in the house and enjoy the lifestyle he provided. She suggested I avoid embarrassing myself or the family by pretending I deserved more. I told her I had not asked for anything yet. She seemed satisfied and ended the call by warning that dragging matters through court would humiliate everyone, especially Lucas. That same night, while reviewing property records I had quietly collected over time, I discovered that Ryan had placed a second mortgage on our family home 18 months earlier, without my knowledge or signature. Under the laws that applied, he had required my approval for such a transaction. I photographed the document and added it to my growing file. I decided to let them continue believing I was defeated. People who underestimate others often create the largest openings for surprise. Ruby remained a steady source of support during these weeks. When the social pressure intensified, I spoke with her about the growing isolation. She reminded me that true friends would stand by me and that the current silence from others revealed their true priorities. Her perspective helped me stay grounded. I contacted Victoria Grant, an experienced family law attorney recommended through Ruby's professional network. Her office occupied the second floor of a restored building in a quiet Manhattan neighborhood with warm wood paneling and framed credentials lining the walls. Victoria was in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that assessed situations quickly. I sat across from her and laid out 3 years of organized documentation: the debts, the unauthorized signatures, the affair Ryan's demands, and the social pressure. She reviewed each folder methodically, making notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finished, Victoria looked at me with clear respect. "You have done exceptional work here," she said. "Most clients arrive in crisis. You arrived prepared." I told her I was not interested in conflict for its own sake. I wanted freedom and security for Lucas. Victoria explained the options under New York law. Since we lived in an equitable distribution state, fighting for half of everything remained possible, but that would also mean assuming half of the more than $5 million in total liabilities attached to the assets. I explained that I wanted Ryan to receive exactly what he had demanded. Victoria studied me for a moment and then pulled a legal reference book from her shelf. She described how when marital assets are divided, the associated debts can be assigned to the party receiving those assets through a liability assumption clause. If Ryan insisted on taking full ownership of the house, the vehicles, the company, and all properties, he could also be required to assume complete responsibility for every loan mortgage and obligation tied to them. The key was making the agreement explicit and ensuring he signed it voluntarily with full awareness of the terms. Victoria noted that Ryan would likely not read the lengthy document carefully. His ego and certainty that he already understood everything would work in our favor. We would include the liability assumption clause on page 47 of a 52-page agreement. We would also add a waiver of independent financial review on a later page, acknowledging that he had the opportunity for expert examination and chose to decline it. If he read it carefully, we would be no worse off than before. If he did not, the outcome would be very different. The pressure continued from multiple directions at once. Lauren called me directly one afternoon, her voice filled with artificial sweetness. She mentioned that she and Ryan were looking at properties together and that financing had become complicated because of the divorce timeline. She asked if I could speed things along to make the transition easier for everyone. I let the silence stretch before replying that I would take her request under consideration. Ryan followed with an email, always careful to create a written record. He stated that his patience was wearing thin and that if I did not sign within 2 weeks, he would file a motion claiming deliberate delay. His lawyer had advised him there were grounds. The threats arrived through formal letters from his attorney as well. Even acquaintances reached out with advice about accepting reality and moving on. Buried in Lauren's call was useful information. Financing complications meant Ryan needed clean assets on paper to secure new loans. He was attempting to leverage properties already deep in debt, likely to fund his new life with her. He was not only greedy but also increasingly desperate. I showed the email to Victoria. She almost smiled. "Your husband is building our case for us with every threat he sends," she said. I agreed and decided to let him continue pushing. Each demand added another layer to the record we were creating. The family meeting was Rose's idea. She summoned us to her dining room, insisting we settle matters like civilized people. Ryan sat at the head of the table with Rose to his right. My father-in-law, James, who was a few years older than Rose, sat nearby along with several cousins and an uncle. I was placed at the far end of the long table. Rose began by announcing that I had agreed to accept Ryan's terms and would sign the papers that week. Ryan smiled and said he had always known I would come around because I understood I was not equipped for serious negotiation. James cleared his throat and added that Ryan was being extremely generous by allowing me to keep Lucas. I replied quietly that Lucas was my priority, and I only wanted what was best for him. Ryan told me to stop dragging things out and sign. I looked down at my hands, performing the defeated wife they expected. Then I said they were right, and I would sign once I understood everything clearly. Rose seemed pleased and told Ryan she had predicted I would realize I had no other choice. Across the room, I noticed Lucas watching from the doorway where the nanny was supposed to keep him occupied. His small face showed confusion and worry. I gave him a gentle smile. What no one in that room realized was that I had not surrendered. I had simply allowed them to believe I had. That night, I sat alone in the modest two-bedroom apartment I had rented after moving out of the family home. The space was clean and safe, with enough room for Lucas and me to begin rebuilding. My son had fallen asleep an hour earlier, his favorite stuffed elephant tucked under one arm. I watched him breathe for a few minutes, this small person who had become the center of my universe. Then I walked to the kitchen table where my documents were spread out. Nearly 3 years of preparation had led to this point. I reviewed the final agreement one more time. 52 pages in total. The liability assumption clause was buried on page 47, exactly as Victoria and I had planned. The waiver of independent financial review appeared on page 49. Everything was legal and transparent for anyone who bothered to examine it carefully. Ryan would not look. I was certain of that, though certainty and reality sometimes differ. My hands trembled slightly as I closed the folder. On the counter, I had laid out my outfit for the next day, a simple gray blazer, white blouse, and minimal jewelry. The only piece that carried real meaning was the thin gold ring with a small sapphire that my grandmother had left me years earlier. It was the one asset Ryan had never thought to claim. Lucas stirred in his sleep and mumbled something about pancakes. I returned to his room and sat on the edge of the bed, brushing hair from his forehead. "Whatever happens tomorrow," I whispered, "we are going to be okay." The words were meant for him, but I needed to hear them as well. I did not sleep much that night, but fear no longer controlled me. I was ready for whatever the morning would bring. The morning of the hearing arrived with a mild winter chill that felt almost gentle for early January in the New York area. I dropped Lucas off at Ruby's apartment where my older sister had insisted on keeping him for the day. She gave me a steady look and a quick hug before I left. "Whatever happens in there, you have already done everything right," she said. I kissed Lucas goodbye, promised I would see him soon, and drove my aging Toyota sedan toward the courthouse in Manhattan. Ryan's Mercedes was already parked in the lot when I arrived. He had reached the building early, eager to claim his victory. He had no idea what was waiting inside those walls. I walked through the glass doors and felt the familiar hum of a place where families came to end chapters. Lawyers moved briskly with folders, clerks stamped documents, and couples sat in quiet clusters. Room 4B waited at the end of a long hallway. Through the narrow window in the door, I could see Ryan already seated at the table with his lawyer, Daniel Pierce. Both men looked relaxed, as though the outcome had already been decided. Victoria Grant stood outside waiting for me. She asked how I was feeling. I told her I was ready. She touched my arm briefly and said that no matter the result, I had already proven I was far stronger than anyone had given me credit for. I replied that I was not trying to prove anything to them. I simply wanted to walk away free. We entered the room together. Ryan looked up and offered his familiar confident smile, the one that said he had already won. I took my seat beside Victoria without responding. Let him enjoy the moment while it lasted. The courtroom was smaller and more intimate than I had pictured, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead. The gallery seats were mostly empty except for two figures in the front row. Lauren sat there in a striking red dress checking her phone. Beside her, Rose looked immaculate in a Chanel suit, her posture radiating the certainty of someone who had never been told no. They had come to watch Ryan's triumph and my supposed humiliation. I settled into my chair and studied my husband across the aisle. He wore his best navy suit with a gold tie clip that caught the light. The luxury watch gleamed on his wrist. To anyone who did not know better, he appeared to be a man fully in control. Daniel Pierce leaned over and whispered something to Ryan. I caught fragments about how routine this would be, and that they would be home by lunch. Ryan nodded without much interest. That was when I noticed the tension around Daniel's eyes and the tightness in his jaw. He kept glancing at the thick document folder between them and then at Ryan, who had not even opened it. The clerk announced Judge Eleanor Whitman. A woman in her early 60s entered from chambers, her gray hair pinned back neatly and reading glasses perched on her nose. She called the matter of our divorce to order and asked if both parties were prepared to proceed. Daniel confirmed they were ready. Victoria confirmed the same. Judge Whitman nodded and said we had a settlement agreement to review. The clerk began reading the terms into the record with clinical detachment. Mrs. Saunders agrees to relinquish all claims to the marital residence located in the suburbs north of New York City, along with all motor vehicles including one Mercedes SUV and one aging Toyota sedan. The list continued through investment accounts, the company known as Empire Development Group, and all its holdings. Every asset Ryan had demanded was formally transferred to his sole ownership. Lauren squeezed Rose's arm and beamed. Judge Whitman looked over her glasses at me and asked if I understood that by signing, I was relinquishing my rights to these assets. I said I understood. She asked if I had adequate time to review the agreement with my counsel. I confirmed that I had. Daniel Pierce cleared his throat and asked that the record note his client had been advised to obtain independent financial review, but had elected to waive that right. Judge Whitman turned to Ryan and asked directly if that was accurate. Ryan did not hesitate. He said he had built the company himself and knew exactly what it was worth. He did not need any accountant telling him what he already knew. Judge Whitman instructed him to sign the waiver on the appropriate page. Ryan took the pen and signed with a flourish. I watched Daniel's face as Ryan handed the pen back. The lawyer was flipping through pages rapidly, now searching. His eyes stopped on page 47. The color drained from his face. He whispered urgently to Ryan to wait, but Ryan was already turning to the final page and signing his name with satisfaction. He announced that it was done. Daniel's face went white. He gripped the edge of the table and said Ryan's name in a voice barely above a whisper. Ryan laughed and slid the signed document toward the clerk, saying it was finished and they could wrap things up. Daniel told him he did not understand. The liability assumption clause on page 47 changed everything. Judge Whitman held up her hand and asked if there was an issue. Daniel looked from Ryan to the judge to me, and I could see the exact moment he realized nothing could undo what had happened. He explained that his client might not have fully understood the terms. Victoria interrupted smoothly and reminded everyone that Ryan had been asked directly whether he wanted independent financial review. He had declined and signed the waiver voluntarily. The agreement was now executed. Ryan's voice lost its confidence as he asked what everyone was talking about and what was on page 47. Daniel handed him the document with his finger pointing to the relevant section. I watched my husband's eyes move across the text. The clause stated that the party receiving the marital assets hereby assumed full personal liability for all debts, liens, mortgages, and financial encumbrances attached to those assets, releasing the other party from any and all obligations related to them. Ryan's face turned gray. He looked up and asked if this meant he was responsible for the debts. Victoria confirmed that as of his signature 30 seconds earlier, he was now responsible for all $5.1 million in liabilities. Lauren's voice cut through from the gallery high and panicked, asking what $5 million meant. She had believed the company was worth far more. I sat perfectly still, watching Ryan finally understand what he had done to himself. He shot to his feet so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He shouted that this was fraud and that I had tricked him. Judge Whitman told him to sit down. Ryan refused and demanded that the agreement be voided because he had been deceived. Judge Whitman removed her reading glasses and fixed him with a steady stare. She said the financial records of his company were public. The debts attached to the properties were matters of record. My attorney had included full disclosure documentation in the agreement packet. Ryan had chosen not to read it. He insisted he did not know. The judge's voice hardened as she reminded him that he had signed a waiver stating he did not need to know. This court could not protect parties from their own arrogance. From the gallery, I heard Lauren's voice, now sharp with disbelief. She asked Ryan what this meant and reminded him that he had told her the company was worth 10 times that amount. She had believed they were going to buy a larger home and start fresh. Ryan reached for her arm, but she yanked away and said she could not believe she had fallen for this. Her father had been right about him all along. Rose was already standing and gathering her purse, her face rigid with fury and embarrassment. Ryan called out to her, but she walked out without looking back. He stood in the wreckage of what he had thought was his victory, finally understanding that he had inherited his own destruction. In the silence that followed Rose's exit, I stood up. Ryan turned to me, his face contorted with rage and desperation. For 8 years, he had been the one in control. Now he was watching that control dissolve completely. He whispered that I had destroyed him and everything he had built. I walked to the center of the courtroom, close enough that he could hear me clearly, but far enough to maintain the distance I had spent years creating. I told him calmly that he had destroyed himself. I had simply stopped cleaning up after him. For 8 years, he had told me I had no value, that I did not understand business or money or anything important. He had called me just a part-time consultant who contributed nothing. He had treated Lucas as a burden rather than a son. He had said I should be grateful he allowed me to stay. I touched my grandmother's ring, drawing strength from its familiar weight. I said I was not grateful. I was free, and for the first time in 8 years, I could finally breathe. I turned to Victoria, who was already packing her briefcase with quiet efficiency. Then I looked back at Ryan one final time. I told him I did not hate him, and was not even angry anymore. I simply refused to let him define who I was for one more second. Ryan started to say we could fix this, but I cut him off. There was nothing left to fix. I walked out of the courtroom, my footsteps steady on the tile floor. Behind me, I heard Ryan calling my name, Daniel, trying to calm him down, and Lauren demanding explanations. I did not look back. I was already gone. Halfway down the courthouse hallway, the shouting grew louder. Through the glass doors of room 4B, I could see Lauren standing in Ryan's path, her carefully applied makeup beginning to run. She shouted about $5.1 million and reminded him he had told her the company was worth far more. She had believed they were going to buy property in a better area and travel. Ryan tried to reach for her, but she pulled away and said she could not believe she had fallen for his lies. Her father had warned her. She laughed bitterly and said Ryan was not even a real success. He was worse than broke. He was deeply in the negative. Victoria appeared beside me and watched the scene with professional detachment. She said she had seen many divorces, but this might be the most complete implosion she had witnessed in real time. I told her I had not planned for this part. Watching Lauren abandon Ryan felt less satisfying than I had expected. It was simply exhausting, like watching the final act of a play that had gone on too long. Through the glass, Lauren was already walking away, her heels clicking furiously against the marble. She pulled out her phone as she passed us without glancing in my direction and called someone saying she had made a huge mistake and wanted to come home. Ryan appeared in the doorway, looking like a man who had just watched his entire world collapse. Our eyes met across the hallway. I felt nothing but relief. I said goodbye quietly and walked toward the exit toward my son, toward whatever came next. Freedom had never felt so simple and complete. 3 months after the hearing, Ryan's carefully constructed empire finished collapsing around him. I learned the details in fragments over coffee with Ruby, who still maintained connections at various financial institutions around the city. The updates arrived like dispatches from a distant conflict that no longer involved me directly. The family home sold first for $625,000, which fell short of covering the original mortgage plus the second lien Ryan had placed without my consent. He walked away, still owing $280,000 on a property he no longer owned. The Mercedes was repossessed by the financing company 2 weeks later. A neighbor later described how the repo team arrived at 3 in the morning and how Ryan stood in the driveway in his bathrobe shouting about lawsuits and wrongful seizure until someone threatened to involve the police. Empire Development Group filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection in March. The commercial properties Ryan had once boasted about went to auction and sold for fractions of their original purchase prices. The remaining debt, nearly $3.2 million, stayed with him personally. He had to move out of the house before the sale closed. Ruby told me he ended up in a small studio apartment in a complex near a major highway north of the city. No doorman, no amenities, nothing that matched the image he had maintained for so long. I nodded as I processed the information, feeling no satisfaction, only a quiet confirmation that consequences had finally caught up. When Ruby mentioned his new job at a small brokerage firm on commission-only terms, I thought about the man I had married and his absolute certainty that he was destined for greatness. He had done this to himself. I had simply stopped protecting him from the results of his choices. Ruby squeezed my hand across the table and said, "That was the best kind of resolution. The kind you do not even have to pursue yourself." Summer arrived and brought a genuine sense of new beginning. Our modest 2-bedroom apartment had gradually transformed from a temporary refuge into something that felt like home. Lucas's drawings covered the refrigerator door. Plants crowded the windowsill, including herbs I had started growing to save on groceries and kept because they brought me simple daily pleasure. The living room held a second-hand sofa that proved far more comfortable than any piece of furniture in the house we had left behind. I returned to full-time work in April as a mid-level financial analyst at a firm in Midtown that valued competence and attention to detail over impressive resumes. By June, I had been promoted to senior financial analyst. My supervisor noted my exceptional focus on catching inconsistencies, a skill I had sharpened during 3 years of quietly tracking every discrepancy in Ryan's financial world. I did not share that particular detail with her. The promotion came with a modest raise that felt like validation of the years I had spent rebuilding my professional identity on my own terms. Lucas was thriving in his new school. He had made friends, quickly joined a local soccer team, and started reading chapter books before bed. He rarely asked about his father anymore, not because I discouraged questions, but because the topic had simply stopped mattering to him in his daily life. One afternoon at the park, he shouted for me to watch as he attempted a cartwheel that ended in a pile of giggles. I applauded from the bench, feeling a kind of uncomplicated happiness I had not experienced in years. My phone buzzed with a notification from a local university's continuing education program. I had been accepted into their evening certification course in advanced investment analysis. Classes would begin in September. Lucas ran over and flopped down beside me on the bench. He asked what I was smiling about. I told him it was good news and that his mom was going back to school just like him. He thought about that for a moment and then asked if we could celebrate with ice cream. We walked to the shop on the corner hand in hand. As we sat with our cones, I realized something that surprised me. This small, steady life in a modest apartment with an ordinary job and simple daily joys was everything I had never known I wanted. It belonged entirely to me and to Lucas. No one could take it away. Almost exactly 1 year after the final hearing, a text message arrived on a Tuesday evening. Ryan wrote that he needed to talk and that it concerned Lucas. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the delete option. Curiosity, or perhaps something softer, made me type back suggesting a public place the next day at noon, a cafe on the west side near the Hudson River. He agreed. When he walked in, I almost did not recognize him. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by simple khakis and a polo shirt that hung loosely on a frame that had lost weight in an unhealthy way. His face looked tired, the confidence completely drained from his features. He sat across from me without ordering anything and said I looked good and happy. I told him I was. Silence stretched between us. He stared at his hands and finally said he was not there to apologize because he knew I would not believe him anyway. He had been in therapy for 6 months. His therapist had told him he needed to take accountability for what he had done to me and to Lucas. He admitted he had been a terrible husband and a worse father. He had treated me as though I did not matter and our son as an afterthought. He had been so obsessed with his own image that he could not see what he was destroying. I waited without speaking. He said he wanted to see Lucas not to get back at me or prove anything, but simply because he wanted to try being a real father if I would allow it. I studied the man I had once loved, searching for any trace of the arrogance I had learned to navigate. I found none. I told him I would consider it, but only under certain conditions. That night, after Lucas had fallen asleep, I sat on the small balcony of our apartment with a cup of tea and watched the city lights flicker in the distance. The sounds of traffic and distant sirens created a familiar urban symphony that had become comforting in its own way. I thought about the woman I had been 3 years earlier, scared and uncertain, convinced that silence was her only option. I thought about the woman I had become, still quiet, but no longer afraid, still careful, but no longer trapped. Ryan wanted back into Lucas's life. 6 months earlier, I would have refused without hesitation. Something in his eyes during our meeting had been different, something broken that was trying to rebuild itself. I could not heal him. That was not my responsibility anymore. But Lucas deserved the chance to know his father, or at least the father Ryan was attempting to become. I set clear conditions. He would continue monthly therapy sessions verified by his counselor. He would maintain steady employment for a minimum of 6 months. Visits would begin supervised and progress only if Lucas felt comfortable. And there was one absolute rule: he would never speak about me in negative terms in front of our son. Ryan agreed to every condition. I did not know whether he would follow through. People make promises about change all the time and deliver nothing. But I had learned something important over the previous 3 years. Boundaries are not about controlling other people's behavior. They are about protecting your own peace. I pulled out a small journal I had started keeping and wrote a few lines. Boundaries are not walls, I wrote. They are doors. You choose who walks through them. I had chosen to give Ryan a door. Whether he walked through it as a better man was up to him. Either way, Lucas and I would be okay. The tea had gone cold, but I did not mind. I sat there a while longer, watching stars emerge through the city's light, and allowed myself to feel something I had almost forgotten was possible: hope. September brought the smell of new notebooks and fresh starts. Lucas began first grade the same week I started my evening certification classes. We developed a routine of doing homework together at the kitchen table, him practicing his letters while I studied investment strategies and portfolio analysis. Sometimes we quizzed each other. He usually won. When I asked what 4 plus 6 equaled, he answered 10 without hesitation. When I asked about the difference between assets and liabilities, he grinned and said he had heard me say those words in my sleep sometimes. We both laughed. Work continued to go well. My supervisor had mentioned the possibility of a partnership track if I kept performing at my current level and completed the certification. For the first time in my adult life, I was building something that belonged entirely to me. Ruby came by one evening with a bottle of good wine. She settled onto our secondhand couch and said she had news. Ryan had made his first voluntary payment on one of his smaller debts the previous month. I took a sip and said that was good for him. Ruby studied me for a moment and then smiled. She asked if I was curious about the details. I told her I was not particularly curious. She nodded and said I really was over it. I looked around our modest apartment at the plants, the drawings, and the evidence of a life rebuilt from the ground up. I told her I had been over it the day I walked out of that courtroom. I simply had not known what would come next. Now I did. The next morning, Lucas and I walked to school together, his hand warm in mine. As we reached the gates, he asked if I was happy. I knelt down to his level and adjusted his backpack straps. I told him yes, I really was. He smiled, that beautiful, uncomplicated smile that made everything worthwhile, and ran toward his classroom. I stood watching until he disappeared inside. Then I turned and walked toward my own future. Before closing this chapter, I want to share something I have come to understand through everything that happened. Ryan was not born cruel. He grew up believing that being a man meant maintaining control over money decisions and everyone around him. His own father had lived the same way. When his business began failing, admitting it would have meant admitting he was not the successful man he needed everyone to see. So he doubled down, took on more debt, projected more confidence, and when the pressure became unbearable, he found someone new who did not yet know the truth. Understanding this does not excuse what he did. It simply explains it, and it helped me stop taking his actions personally. His choices were never really about me. They were about his own fear of being seen as weak. As for me, I had my own patterns to examine. I had avoided conflict because I had watched my parents' marriage collapse into shouting matches and slammed doors. I had believed that silence meant peace. I did not realize I was confusing peace with paralysis. What I learned is that silence can be powerful, but only when it is a deliberate choice rather than a cage. Planning is valuable, but so is knowing when to act, and your worth does not depend on whether the people around you recognize it. If there is one lesson worth carrying forward, it is this: the people who underestimate you are often building their own traps. You do not have to do anything except stay ready. This has been my story. A woman who was told she did not matter and who spent 3 years proving to herself that she did. If these words have meant something to you, I invite you to like this video and subscribe if you want to hear more accounts of people who were counted out and found their way forward anyway. Check the description for related stories about resilience and quiet strength. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I am Daisy, and I hope that wherever you are and whatever you are facing, you are stronger than they think. You simply may not have found your moment yet, but you will. The colonial home itself had become a symbol of the life I thought we were building. Its white columns and wraparound porch looked picture-perfect from the street, especially in autumn, when the maple trees turned brilliant shades of red and gold. Inside the living room featured a large fireplace where we had once gathered as a family on winter evenings, though those evenings had grown rarer as Ryan's late meetings increased. The kitchen, with its granite counters and stainless steel appliances, had been the heart of the house, where I prepared meals and helped Lucas with homework while Ryan's office door remained closed down the hall. Even the backyard, with its small swing set and flower beds I tended on weekends, represented the domestic world Ryan had encouraged me to focus on while he managed everything else. Letting go of that physical space had been difficult at first, but the apartment we moved into felt lighter, as though the walls themselves carried less weight. Ruby's presence in my life during those years proved invaluable in ways I had not fully appreciated until later. She not only helped with the initial credit check and documentation, but also offered practical support when I finally moved out. She helped me find the modest apartment, brought over boxes for packing, and even watched Lucas during some of the more difficult meetings with lawyers. Her steady belief that I was making the right choices even when the path felt uncertain gave me the courage to continue. On nights when doubt crept in, a phone call with Ruby would remind me that I was not alone and that the plan we had built together was sound. Her role as both sister and confidant made the isolation from other friends and family more bearable. She never judged the years I had spent in silence, understanding that strategy sometimes required patience that others might mistake for weakness. Returning to full-time work brought its own set of challenges and rewards. The firm in Midtown was fast-paced, with glass-walled conference rooms and analysts who debated market trends over takeout lunches. My first few weeks involved catching up on new software and industry changes that had occurred while I was away. Yet the skills I had honed during those 3 years of careful observation transferred more easily than I expected. When my supervisor praised my ability to spot discrepancies in financial reports during a team meeting, I felt a quiet pride that had nothing to do with Ryan or anyone else's approval. The promotion to senior financial analyst came with increased responsibilities and the chance to mentor a junior colleague, something I had never imagined doing again. It felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had been set aside for too long. In the months that followed the hearing, Lucas and I developed new traditions that made our smaller home feel complete. Sunday mornings often involved pancakes in the kitchen, while music played from a small speaker on the counter. We would plan the week ahead, with Lucas choosing one activity for us to do together, whether it was a trip to the local library or a walk in a nearby park. Bedtime stories became longer and more interactive, with him asking questions about the characters and sometimes creating his own endings. These ordinary moments, free from the tension that had once filled our old house, became the foundation of the life I had fought to protect. Watching him grow confident and curious reminded me daily why the difficult choices had been worth it. The final lesson I carry from this experience is one I hope reaches anyone listening who feels trapped or underestimated. The people around you may not see your strength or your plans, but that does not diminish them. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can be a powerful tool for preparation. Patience is not the same as passivity, and the moment you decide to act after gathering what you need can change everything. You are stronger than the voices that doubt you, including your own on difficult days. Keep documenting your truth, keep protecting what matters, and know that your moment will come. When it does, you will be ready.